أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. يا أيها الذين آمنوا كونوا قوامين بالقسط شهداء لله ولو على أنفسكم أو الوالدين والأقربين إن يكن غنيا أو فقيرا فالله أولى بهما فلا تتبعوا الهوى أن تعدلوا وإن تلووا أو تعرضوا فإن الله كان بما تعملون خبيرا. يا أيها الذين آمنوا بالله ورسوله والكتاب الذي نزل على رسوله والكتاب الذي أنزل من قبل ومن يكفر بالله وملائكته وكتبه ورسله واليوم الآخر فقد ضل ضلالا بعيدا. إن الذين آمنوا ثم كفروا ثم آمنوا ثم كفروا ثم ازدادوا كفرا لم يكن الله ليغفر لهم ولا ليهديهم سبيلا. بشر المنافقين بأن لهم عذابا أليما. الذين يتخذون الكافرين أولياء من دون المؤمنين أيبتغون عندهم العزة فإن العزة لله جميعا. وقد نزل عليكم في الكتاب أن إذا سمعتم آيات الله يكفر بها ويستهزأ بها فلا تقعدوا معهم حتى يخوضوا في حديث غيره إنكم إذا مثلهم إن الله جامع المنافقين والكافرين في جهنم جميعا. صدق الله العظيم.
Assalamu alaikum. Jazakallah Karim for that really lovely introduction. So yeah, assalamu alaikum to all the Muslims in the audience. Welcome to any non-Muslims in the audience. All are welcome. I'm so excited and have been so excited about doing this session, mainly because, as I'm sure many of you who are familiar with this autobiography, this book, and also with the protagonist, the person who it's written about, it would have most likely had a very strong impact on you when you read it, and or even when you learnt about his history and his journey, that of Malcolm X. And for me, it really was a book that had a real influence on a lot of my values, beliefs, took me on a real journey, something that I would say was even a turning point in my life when I read it. And I'm so delighted that this book club chose to do this book and chose to bring so many of us on this journey to like relive or even experience it for the first time. When I was talking to my sister about doing this session, she actually said to me, "Oh, which version of the autobiography is it, the Alex Haley?" And I said to her, "Is there any other version that has really, you know, stood the test of time, that has been as widely read?" And I would argue that there isn't. So some of the beauty of this story isn't just the fact that it's Malcolm X's story, it's the fact that Alex Haley wrote it in such a beautiful way that throughout you literally hear Malcolm's voice. So I really love the way that we began. That was a really beautiful, beautiful recitation. And also I'm very biased, but I love hearing other sisters recite because we don't get treated to that very often. So before we begin, what I would like for you all to do, because obviously the intention is that I'm going to talk from maybe around 45 minutes, maybe a bit less, we'll see how we get on. And afterwards there'll be some time for like some Q&A and just some general discussion. I don't even really want to call it questions and answers per se, because I think when it's a book club, some of you who have read it or are reading it or even haven't read it will have your own thoughts about what you're hearing, and I want us to have that open discussion because that's one of the things I really enjoy. For me, I read this coming from a very personal context of a lot of my intersections. Obviously, I'm a Black Muslim woman, and Malcolm X being one of the most prominent Black Muslim figures we have in our community. I also do a lot of grassroots work, trying to constantly look at ways in which we can support our communities. Working in the criminal justice system, I try not to practice law in a vacuum. I'm constantly looking at how does it affect minorities, how does it affect different communities, looking at police brutality, disproportionality of harsher sentences. And then also I'm really blessed to currently be studying, like I know many of you on the call are students. I'm also doing my master's in law, but exploring a lot of topics about, for example, race, crime and justice, and also race, crime and literature, race, law and literature, and how all of that really impacts our criminal justice system in the UK, in the US, and also internationally. So I'm coming at it from a lot of context and angles. And once I start my presentation, inshallah, you'll see where I'm going with it. And hopefully it will encourage you and give you a slightly maybe different perspective in some instances of things that maybe you hadn't considered before. So yeah, before I begin, what I'll ask from you all, because I do like these things to be interactive, no one wants to just be spoken at for a whole evening, but I am really obsessed with knowing people's backgrounds, heritage. Can you put in the chat 2 things: where you are from in terms of heritage, And when I say heritage, I mean, if you're British or whatever, if you know any more, like where your parents are from, let me know. And then where are you physically? So are you in the UK? Are you in the US? Are you up north? Are you down south? Just give me a little bit of background, give me a bit of context. It'll be really interesting to see where people are from, where people are calling in from, inshallah. And I'm going to kick off whilst I leave you all to sort of introduce yourselves. For me personally, I am Nigerian heritage, very, very proud West African, Nigerian, Pan-Africanist, if I can even also say that. And I am based in East London now, so literally from Africa to East London. So yeah, it'll be good to hear some of your own introductions as well. Oh, mashallah, Zara's from East London too. We love a bit of East London. You can get your ethnic food, you can get your halal stuff, you can get everything. That's what I say about East London. That's why I like it. Okay, so I've got some slides. I'm not gonna like kill you with PowerPoint. I'm gonna do a lot of talking over the slides and really just sharing my own thoughts. And really, really helpfully, Sister Lena did a really brilliant summary of all the chapters, so that will also save me from doing that a little bit. So I wanted to put some of this in context. Many of you will note that, hold on, what have I done? Oh, sorry, give me 1 second. I just realized I'm not even, am I sharing? Okay. Oh, there we go. Okay, so hopefully you can see this PowerPoint now. All I did was open it before rather than sharing it. Oh, you'd think I was a pro at this by now. So I entitled this talk and this session, Black Power and the Pursuit of Racial Social Justice. Some of that comes from what I was just explaining to you all about my own context as to what I want to bring to this session and sort of what my own background is, working as a criminal barrister, doing the grassroots work, being a Black Muslim. But also, I think hopefully you gauge from some of that summary that Lena already gave about what the three chapters cover from 11 to 13. It really is, in terms of Malcolm X's journey, this turning point in his life where he starts turning to a bit of activism and he starts being proud of his Blackness and understanding that heritage. And he starts getting involved more in the Nation of Islam. And by getting involved more in the Nation of Islam, in the context of the time, that was getting more involved in this civil rights movement that was going on at the time. So I've given a very vague breakdown of the dates, just to give it some historical context as well. And I've put some images there of that time where people were marching, Black people in the US were being brutalized by the police, were facing violence, inequality. So Malcolm X was in prison for about 6 years in Massachusetts, and that's the first chapter, chapter 11, which is called Saved, and it's such a brilliant title for that chapter, and we'll go on to explore that a bit more. Then the second chapter in the middle, which is called Savior, and in my humble opinion, I'd say it kind of focuses on his relationship with Elijah Muhammad, who was the sort of modern day prophet of the Nation of Islam. And it's actually the shortest in time, but it's quite a substantive chapter. And I think that's almost illustrative of what an influence and how important Elijah Muhammad was in his life. And then between 1953 to 1964, that's a really big chapter, that last one about Minister Malcolm, where he kind of comes into his own. And what I love, honestly, I'm very biased, but one of the reasons I chose to cover this week and these chapters is because I feel like this was such a seminal time, because by the time you get to chapter 13, where he is Minister Malcolm, he is closer to the Malcolm X that a lot of us have seen videos of, have heard, where he's speaking, he's out there, he's recruiting for the temples, and he's that Malcolm X that we know. So that's really why, in terms of the themes I'm going to be focusing on mostly, is really about this Black power and how he started pursuing racial social justice. And also, thank you all so much. I'm seeing that you're all putting in your heritage, your backgrounds. I'm seeing British, Pakistani, East London, Scottish with Indian and Pakistani heritage, from Glasgow, now in Chicago. Wow. And also studied law. Oh, beautiful. Oh, mashallah. That's from Sister Medina, who did that beautiful recitation. Let's see. There we go. Citizen of the world. I love that. But Iraqi origin, based in Leeds, UK. Okay, we've got Turkish based in Berlin. Oh, I love Berlin. And I love Turkey, actually. British Nigerian living in South London. Somali in West London. Oh, we've got someone from Denver, Colorado. That's my terrible American accent, but I try. African American heritage, Southern roots, North Carolina and Florida. I actually lived in Florida for a while, and currently based in Albany, New York. Oh, brilliant. British Grenadian, Gambian. I hope you're all reading this because this is really brilliant. Black Muslim, Afro-Trinidadian, European American roots by way of Toronto, Canada. Also love Canada. British Muslim, Ghanaian roots. Oh, brilliant. Oh, I love this as well. Afghan residing in London, UK born, Jamaican heritage. Okay, brilliant. So it's good to know we are a really nice, diverse bunch here. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as we go along. So, okay, let's get started a little bit. Okay, so looking at chapter 11, which is called Saved. Now, this was during the 6 years of Malcolm X's incarceration in prison. And there's a number of different themes that come out from this period, which is he essentially enters the prison system as someone who is ignorant about a lot of things because his history and the heritage of his people has essentially been erased. There's also the theme of weaponizing of religion, which we'll come to, where he talks a little bit about how the Bible was used, for example, in the history and the context of slavery, and how certain aspects of the Bible were whitewashed in order to kind of hide the history and justify certain brutal acts towards Black people. He also talks about one of my favorite themes, and one of the things that I find really inspirational about Malcolm X is he talks about how gaining knowledge not only gave him power, but it gave him freedom, which I think is really, really powerful. And Malcolm X was someone who actually wasn't educated, I think past the 8th grade or something like that. And actually, when he speaks and you hear him, he comes across as this very articulate, very educated, well-read gentleman, and he did a lot of that himself. I want to say all of it, to be honest, because the stories that he tells even later on in the book about school and earlier on in the book about school show that he didn't really leave there with that powerful education. It also covers the theme of racism being a satanic sin, and that I'm going to come back to because I think that's a lesson for all of us today. And then there's something I've termed, I kept looking for a word. I was like, what can I call this? And I ended up calling it Enlightenment Enthusiasm. And I'll explain that a bit more. So in terms of this chapter, when Malcolm X is in prison and he talks about how he's really ashamed looking back at the fact that he could barely write well or read well or articulate himself. He talks about how his grammar was really bad, and he started writing to Elijah Muhammad, and he was almost embarrassed because he couldn't really articulate the thoughts and what he wanted to say. And he talks about, and I'm going to sort of quote it from the book, he talks about how he says the Black prisoner symbolized white society's crime of keeping Black men oppressed and deprived and ignorant and unable to get decent jobs, turning them into criminals. So he's here sitting in prison and he's seeing almost like he's outside of himself, looking in at the situation that he's in. And he sees it from this really profound lens where he's saying that he can see how this system of mass incarceration is actually an illustration of the way that society are treating people who look like him and come from similar backgrounds to him. he uses the quote when he's talking about a little bit about his journey in prison to gain knowledge. He refers to it as a homemade education, right? So he's self-taught. And he essentially says that in the street, and I'll quote, he says, "In the street, I'd been the most articulate hustler out there. I had commanded attention when I said something, but now trying to write simple English, I not only wasn't articulate, I wasn't even functional." So you have to bear that in mind, right? When he entered this system that is designed to break people, arguably, the system that is designed to keep these Black men down, to keep them ignorant, that's how he started, right? That was his almost like entry point into this system. But then he starts talking about how he started reading and reading and reading. And one of the most fascinating things he did was he started reading the dictionary. And he talks about how at the beginning he would read all the pages of the dictionary, starting from aardvark, going all the way through. And he would practice writing them as well to improve his handwriting. So all of a sudden, his vocabulary starts opening up, and he says that he's almost like dreaming of these words and thinking of these words and staying up all night to study these words. And he uses this really beautiful phrase where he talks about a new world that opened up for him as he started reading. And what I think is incredible is if you speak to anyone who's ever been incarcerated, who's ever been in prison, and I spent some time in the US working on sort of anti-death penalty cases in Houston, and well, it was death penalty cases, but I was doing anti-death penalty work in Houston and Florida. And if you talk to any people who have been incarcerated, they talk about a lot of the psychological struggles of being locked up for a long time, not having your freedom. And so in that context, Malcolm X says about his reading of books, he said, "Months passed without my even thinking about being imprisoned. In fact, up to then, I never had been so truly free in my life." That's so, so powerful. And I think that's one thing that we know, for example, he was there starting his path towards Islam, and Islam is this religion of knowledge. It talks about knowledge a lot, a great deal, how important it is for us to seek knowledge, gain knowledge, share knowledge. And he talks about how gaining knowledge was so, so powerful for him that he didn't even feel like he was in prison. And I think that's really, really profound if you think about it. So he was fortunate in the sense that in his prison, he talks about how they organized debates, and they had instructors who came to teach them from places like Harvard University or Boston University, and these brilliant universities. And again, I think that's another thing, right? I think that's linked to almost like the qadr of Allah, like the destiny of God, that in prison, he gets all this exposure to these academics, to this knowledge, to this library that he wouldn't have had in the outside world. And he's slowly understanding that people from his background and from his context are usually deprived of this kind of knowledge. So when I talk about ignorance and erasure, he talks about how learning from Elijah Muhammad showed him that his history had been whitened. And later on, he talks even more about how not only had it been whitened, it kind of been erased and deleted. So he says the history of the Negro had been covered. He's talking about school. He's reflecting on his time at school. And he said the history of the Negro had been covered in one paragraph, and the teacher had gotten a big laugh with his jokes that Negroes' feet are so big that when they walk, they leave a hole in the ground. And he basically says that was in his educational history, what they taught him about his people. And the thing is, he was writing that all those decades ago. And now for those who either work in the education system, have young children, cousins, nieces, nephews, whatever, or even recall your own school time that wasn't that long ago, how much do we learn about Black history? It has much changed, and I would argue that it hasn't, because I recall being at school and really only really learning about the transatlantic slave trade when it came to Black people. And I remember being really embarrassed, actually, even learning about that at school, because, you know, all of my white friends would look at me and they're like, oh, so your parents were slaves or your grandparents were slaves. And I was thinking, well, no, my family are living happily in Africa. And it's really profound that even back then he was talking about how Black history, there was so much erasure of it, and we're still fighting that battle as Black people and even non-Black people to learn the history of Black people. It's still something that's not mainstream. It's still something that is erased. It is still something that is dangerously mistold. And I think what's important from reading this chapter is to understand the devastating impact of hiding a person's history from them. So one of the reasons that I asked you all to put in the chat, see, I'm very sneaky like this. One of the reasons I asked you all to put in the chat, sort of, you know, where are you from, where are you based, all that kind of thing, is because in this chapter, Malcolm talks about not even knowing really where he's from. He doesn't really understand where he's from, and he's learning it. And the more he's learning about this history, about how name, culture, heritage, knowledge was stripped from his people generations ago through slavery, through oppression, it's really profound, because look how easily every single person on this call was able to say, oh, I'm this, I'm that, my parents are from here, I live here, I come from this, I'm proud of this. We're so easily able to do that. And when you tell a people that they don't have a place in history, or they don't have a place in a story, so in this context, some of it is the fact that as a Black man in America at that time, he was almost told like his people don't have a place in religion, right? They were almost told like, this religion is for you to save you. And at that time, in his context, that was Christianity. They were telling him, this religion is here to save you, to almost like civilize you, but you have no part in building it. What that does is that takes away a person's pride. It takes away their ability to really connect, and it obviously draws them further away from a path of good or of righteousness. So he starts falling in love with this religion of Islam because he's hearing that, you know, the Black man is powerful, the Black man is strong, the Black man has been robbed of X, Y, and Z. And actually that is to sort of brainwash the Black man and the Black woman and to keep them down. And for him, that is something that is so empowering. And I say for him, that is so empowering. When I read this book so many decades later as a Black woman, I found it empowering. I found it, there was so much I didn't know. I remember reading it, and then it would lead me to read, and I've put some of the more contemporary writers' pictures on here. It led me to say, okay, I want to read more about Anita Davis. I want to read more about Maya Angelou. I want to see what Joel Baldwin was talking about. I want to read W.E.B. Du Bois. And these are people that some of them he talks about as well. And it's that enthusiasm you get from suddenly realizing there's so much more to your history and there's so much more to your background. So one of the things as well that he talks about a lot, and I think it's really interesting because Malcolm X in this chapter is in prison. So he's incarcerated because he broke the law and he's a criminal. But then he says, when he's learning about slavery and everything, he said, I never will forget how shocked I was when I began reading about slavery's total horror. It made such an impact on me. And he refers to it as the world's most monstrous crime. And it's interesting that in the media and just in general sort of stereotyping, Black people generally are almost like demonized as being inherently criminal. And yet the world's most monstrous crime wasn't committed by us, it was committed against us. And he talks about that sort of enlightenment. And he talks about Elijah Muhammad's teaching, which focused on the white man being the devil. And he talks a lot about this, he elaborates on it, but essentially saying that the white man is almost like Satan, because he's committed all these heinous crimes against humanity, against Black people. And I'm not going to get into the debate as to whether or not Malcolm X kind of changed, or some people say, oh, he watered down his opinions by the end of his life when he left the Nation of Islam and accepted, Islam. I'm not going to go into that so much, but what I will say is he did move from a place later on in his journey, and I'm not doing a spoiler alert for those of you who are thinking she's telling us what's going to happen in the rest of his life, but he certainly moved away from saying that all white people were the devil. But I think the point that is really important from this chapter, when he talks about the white man being the devil, is he brings in this concept of racism being a satanic sin. And I use that term a lot, that racism is a satanic sin, because to think that someone is lesser than you because of the color of their skin, and there's a lot of studies to show that race is really a social construct rather than a biological construct, like we're led to believe. It's really a social construct. It's something that society has created to be able to divide us. And some people argue that Satan, or Iblis in the Islamic terminology, when Iblis or Satan or the devil refused to bow down to Adam, alayhi salam, Prophet Adam, that was like the first type of racism that we saw in creation. Now, some will say, no, that wasn't about racism. It was about arrogance. It was about, some different things. And arguably, maybe it is. I'm not a scholar, I'm not a sheikh, but I also note the fact that Prophet Adam was a Black man. The name Adam in Arabic means, very dark black. And we had this situation where God had created Iblis, he had created Adam, and Iblis was asked to bow down to Adam, and he refused. He said, look at me, I'm made of fire, he's made of clay, why should I bow down to him, etc., etc. And I think that is a really interesting concept, that actually racism, it's not just something that we frown upon, it's not just something that is undesirable or unpalatable. It's actually like a satanic sin. So if you're a person of faith or you're a person of religion, you should be denouncing that with your whole chest, with your whole soul, with your whole spirit. I don't want to spend too much time, more time on this chapter, but obviously, as I mentioned, there was also this, when I talk about weaponizing of religion, that's more to do with that sort of him challenging in prison when he starts doing these debates and things. He challenges this concept, for example, that Jesus was white, or that some of the apostles of Jesus or Prophet Isa were white. And he says, obviously they were Hebrews. Can you actually tell me they were white people? And when he challenges it, he gets his satisfaction of the sort of Bible teacher or the white person teaching him not being able to actually refute that or reject that. And I think that's something that, especially for me as a Muslim, and I think for all Muslims, we need to be so careful about. If there's racism within our own communities and people are saying to you, oh, well, there's no racism in Islam, or in Islam, everyone's created equal, but you're ignoring the fact that actually in practice, Black Muslims are treated in a different way or marginalized, or the issues of Black people aren't considered issues for the Muslim community, then actually we're falling into that trap of weaponizing our religion and making it seem like it's a religion that's not for everyone. And I think, again, that's a big sin and a big thing that people need to think about. And then finally, the other thing, which is going to be a theme throughout these chapters, is about what I called Enlightenment Enthusiasm. As he's learning about these contexts, he wants to share it with everyone. He wants to share it with the other people in the prison. And he gets so frustrated when people aren't as shocked as he is. They don't want to convert to Islam as quickly as he does. And I think there's such a lesson in that as well. And there are like ayats in the Quran that talk about how sometimes people's hearts are hardened, or their ears won't hear the truth, whether or not you call it the truth. They won't hear it. They're not ready to hear it. And I think sometimes when you find knowledge and you change, you want everyone to come along with you like that. I remember reading Malcolm X's autobiography and deciding I was no longer going to chemically straighten my hair. I wasn't going to let the media tell me that I needed to have straight hair. I was going to embrace my Afro hair. And I remember telling all of my Black female friends, you know, you shouldn't put chemicals in your hair. You should do this, you should do that, you should be. And I had all this enthusiasm, and sometimes people just aren't ready to hear it at that time. And I think it's interesting, again, on his journey, how he refined how he approached that message and how he looked upon people who weren't ready to receive it at the time he wanted to give it, if I can put it that way. I think, yeah, really, he just talked about how reading had changed the course of his life forever. And one of the sort of figures he puts when he's talking about slavery is he says that over 115 million African Blacks, close to the 1930s population of the US, were murdered or enslaved during the slave trade. And for him, this is really mind-blowing, right? Because he's like, this is so big. Why hadn't he heard of it before? And I think the last thing that I sort of just wanted to touch on was, I was obviously talking about rights, and these chapters talking a lot about the pursuit of racial social justice. Malcolm talks about the word and the phrase civil rights, and he talks about how actually, before speaking of civil rights, shouldn't America be talking about human rights? And he essentially says that the Black man in America doesn't have any human rights, and that's really what they should be talking about. So he also, when he's talking about erasure, he says, because the white man had completely erased the slave's past, a Negro in America can never know his true family name, or even what tribe he was descended from, the Mandingos, the Wolof, the Sere, the Fula, the Fanti, the Ashanti, or others. I told them that some slaves were brought from Africa, spoke Arabic, and were Islamic in their religion. What I thought was really interesting about that, when he says, because the slaves' history had been erased, people didn't know about their tribes and their history. But I find it fascinating, even now, as many Black Muslims will tell you, people question, you know, your Islam, or question whether or not you can truly be Muslim, not realizing that all these historic tribes, the ones he's just listed, had this background and this heritage of Islam that was so rich in it, that Islam came to Africa first before it went to the Arab world. And so it's interesting that he talks about, you know, because the white man erased his history, people don't know this about us, that actually, you know, many slaves from Africa were speaking Arabic and Islam was their religion. People still don't know that. It's not just in America in that context. It's something that we're still kind of fighting today. So I spent a lot of time on that chapter. Let me just move on to chapter 12. Oh, look at that. I accidentally did something fancy with that slide. Let me go back. Oh, there we go. And one more. Okay, brilliant. So in chapter 12, Malcolm talks a little bit about, and by the way, guys, feel free to put stuff in the chat if you've got questions or comments, whatever, engage with each other. So as I said, I know it's always tough to have someone just sort of speaking at you, but I'll wrap up and then we can talk a bit more. So then moving on to chapter 12, which is entitled Savior, it really focuses on that relationship with Elijah Muhammad. And for those of you who read the book or know a lot about Nation of Islam, he referred to himself, Elijah Muhammad, the man pictured on the slide, as being like the modern day prophet, that he was like a prophet of Islam. So as Malcolm is learning about Islam and he's joining the nation, he really puts this Elijah Muhammad on a huge pedestal. And a big significant part of Malcolm's journey, again, without doing a spoiler alert, is this relationship that he actually has with Elijah Muhammad. And he actually ends the last chapter saying, I was his most faithful servant, and I know today that I did believe in him more firmly than he believed in himself. In the years to come, I was going to have to face a psychological and spiritual crisis. So again, the way Alex Haley kind of writes this, he gives this premonition of what's to come, and what is to come is going to be, you know, quite something quite difficult when it comes to their relationship. But anyway, he gets released from prison and he's learning more about Islam, and he's getting more involved in the Nation of Islam. And what is amazing is that he's now attained all of this knowledge. He's been in prison, educating himself, articulating things, converting people. And when he comes out, he sees like a completely different kind of Muslim, not Muslim, sorry, Black community that he's never seen before. So he talks about how he sees this discipline, this structure. Elijah Muhammad takes him to Black-owned businesses like grocery stores, and he's never really seen anything like this. And he sees it in his brother's house with the brother's family. He talks about how he saw his brother, you know, sort of leading the family in prayer and that kind of thing. And he starts really finding his voice in this chapter. And it's in this chapter that he essentially changes his surname from Little to X. And actually he talks about receiving his X. And that goes back to the fact that he's talking about the fact that Little was the name of some sort of slave master who probably raped, you know, one of his ancestors. And so he rejects and completely denounces that name and decides to go by X, which was very commonplace for the Muslims in the Nation of Islam. And what I love in this chapter is also him talking a lot about the fishing. So he talks about going fishing, which is essentially trying to get new recruits for the temple. That's what the place of worship was called for the Nation of Islam Muslims. He talks about going fishing, and he talks about being able to literally switch between this lingo, the lingo of the streets, and this new articulate knowledge that he had. And it's interesting because it's almost like trial and error as well, because he talks a lot about how it sort of fell on deaf ears quite often. Sometimes people weren't really interested. Some of them were saying that he's lost his mind, he's gone crazy in prison. But in his sort of ear, whispering all the time, encouraging him, pushing him forward, is this Elijah Muhammad, who he really looks highly upon. And I put a note there about distrust and envy, right? And that's really, really interesting because, again, it's almost like a premonition of what's to come. In this chapter, they go way back into the 1930s and start talking about Elijah Muhammad's childhood, because they almost believed that even from a child, it was like prophesied that this Elijah Muhammad was going to be a prophet or a leader for the Nation of Islam. And he talks about how it caused a lot of distrust and envy in the community, and him and his family had to go on the run. And anyone who knows, and I'm not spoiling the book, I promise, but anyone who knows about the future of, or the sort of history of Malcolm X's life, coming to the end of his life, there was a lot of distrust and envy surrounding him, be it from the FBI, be it from the Nation of Islam. Until this day, no one knows who murdered Malcolm X. And so it's interesting that in this chapter, Elijah Muhammad is, Malcolm is learning Elijah Muhammad's life story. And it kind of ends with him saying that, you know, he had to go on the run. People wanted to harm him. People, you know, there was a lot of envy. They didn't like that he had been picked as a prophet. And we kind of see almost history repeating itself, but in a slightly different context. So just looking a little bit at this chapter. So I know later on in the book, it's going to focus a lot more on sort of the financial power that Malcolm saw. So he basically says that when he finally came out of prison, he really was able to see how Black people were being exploited, even financially. So he says, I watched brothers entwining themselves in the economic clutches of the white man, who went home every night with another bag of the money drained out of the ghetto. And so he's talking about how he's basically out of prison and he's looking at things with completely new eyes. And when he's talking about seeing the Muslims and the way they interact, and I think, again, this is something that is a beauty of the religion, even now, this brotherhood and sisterhood, he says, I had never dreamed of anything like that atmosphere amongst Black people who had learned to be proud they were Black, who had learned to love other Black people instead of being jealous and suspicious. I thrilled to how we Muslim men used both hands to grasp a Black brother's both hands, voicing and smiling our happiness to meet him again. The Muslim sisters, both married and single, were given an honor and respect that I'd never seen Black men give to their women. And if you think, when you're reading in the earlier chapters, this is the guy who was like relaxing his hair, chemically straightening it, dyeing it red, wearing, I think they called them zoot suits, his fancy hat, feather in it, you know, sleeping with these white women, breaking into people's houses, committing crimes. And to him, that was the norm. That's how Black people live. That's what he saw of his community. So to come out and see this stark contrast, it obviously had a really empowering impact on him. And that's one of the reasons why I said one of the themes of these chapters really is Black power. And he talks about how the Nation of Islam flag, it had the words underneath it, Islam, freedom, justice, and equality. And I think it's really interesting that in the history of US civil rights and US human rights, the Nation of Islam had such a activist context, and Islam, when it came to Black people there, was such a powerful human rights empowering religion. And yet in the UK, it's a religion that people constantly question, Muslims and non-Muslims, whether or not Black people can even really be part of the religion, you know? And I think that that's something we have to question in this country. I think it's something we have to think long and hard about, the fact that actually Islam is this religion of strong racial, social justice. And are we representing it in that way? Or are we actually creating this really unfair and inaccurate picture of Islam, that it's a religion only for one group of people, others aren't included? And when people are talking about BLM, or they're talking about the injustices of the criminal justice system, it has nothing to do with us as Muslims, because it's not about the Quran, and it's not about this, and it's not about that. I think we need to question that a lot in this country. And I think even in other countries, even in the US, people need to revisit that, because Islam has always been this really powerful religion that was about justice and was about racial justice. But I think people and us as a community, in some ways, we've really let that down. So I'm going to try and whiz through, because I'm like conscious of the time a little bit. There's so many things I could quote you from the book. Honestly, I just love it. So I don't know. I hadn't realized that I've done this clickety thing. Okay, so in chapter 13, where he becomes Minister Malcolm X, and he starts leading the temples, and he starts being a real big mover and shaker in the community, it talks a lot about how he really gets into that vibe of rejecting the colonial past. So rejecting the history that's taught to him. When I say he revisits the past, I thought, again, it's linked to that fishing that I was talking about, his role in going to recruit new people to the temple. It's so interesting because he goes to some of his previous adversaries, or the people that he used to sort of run the streets with and have fun with. And he starts talking to them about Islam. And it's interesting because from a lot of them, he gets this warm reception, but they're just not convinced, they're not ready to hear it. And he's sharing this truth. So I think when Lena did her introduction, she said that his friend was too busy eating pork and sleeping with his white women. I think that's what Malcolm says, to receive the message. And Malcolm's a bit frustrated, but he does meet his old sort of friends. They're still involved in criminal activity and criminal lifestyle, but he does his best and he talks to them. And he starts rising up the ranks. People clearly see that he's a good speaker, he's a good orator, and he's really good at, I think he like triples the membership of the temple in Detroit. And he's doing really well, and he's becoming almost Elijah Muhammad's right-hand man. It's not yet in the story, but you can see how that builds up. And what is brilliant in this chapter is he meets his wife, Betty Shabazz, Betty X. And it's really wonderful in this chapter how he describes the role of women. And you can see that he's almost fighting this battle to shake off his past misogyny and shake off his past experiences of what he thinks about women. He's always been very suspicious about women. He's always thought, you know, women are just trying to get one thing. I was about to say ironically. No, but he's always thought, you know, women are very manipulative, they're sneaky, you can't trust them. And then he sees these women who are just religious women. They're teaching each other, they're teaching the community. And I think that view that he sees of women is very much reflected, despite the misconceptions that we see nowadays, of the role of women in Islam generally. Like, women have a really powerful role, a really respected role. And when he first meets Betty, it's really funny because he talks very much about almost, you know, trying to keep her at an arm's distance, and that it's very practical. So he talks about what Elijah Muhammad told him about finding a wife. And he says, Mr. Elijah Muhammad taught us that a tall man married to a too short woman, or vice versa, they looked odd, not matched. He taught that a wife's ideal age was half a man's age plus 7. He taught that women are physiologically ahead of men. Mr. Muhammad taught that no marriage could succeed where the woman did not look up with respect to the man, and that the man had to have something above and beyond the wife in order for her to be able to look to him for psychological security. And he talks about these really technical aspects of Betty, and why he kind of thought that she would be quite a good wife, interestingly enough. And all of it is very, very technical. But what's really, really nice is that later on in that chapter, after he marries Betty, he talks about the children that they had and how they moved to Queens. And he says that one of the things he loves about the religion and about a religious woman is that the beauty that they have inside of a beautiful wife never fades. And he says, you find in your Western civilization that when a man's wife's physical beauty fails, she loses her attraction. But Islam teaches us to look into the woman and teaches her to look into us. And he talks about how he essentially fell in love with Betty after marriage. And she was very supportive, almost like the backbone of the family, put up with him traveling here, there, and everywhere, not being around, checked in on him, supported him. And I think, again, that's also part of his journey, where some of what he describes as being this colonial past or this oppressive past led him to almost like look down on women. But as he starts changing his views, learning his history, and gaining that Black power and that pride in his race, that pride in his history, he sees the role that women have to play in it. And I think that's really, really beautiful, because you do see that journey almost from a misogynist then to this man who really respects women. So just a few additional themes. Well, I've just mentioned that the attitude to women through Betty, we see that. And then Ella, so I didn't mention this, but obviously he talks a lot about how his brother Reginald essentially falls out of favor. So his brother Reginald, being one of the people that brought him to the Nation of Islam, falls out of favor with the Nation of Islam for apparently sort of engaging in sexually promiscuous conduct, which he alludes later becomes a controversy surrounding Elijah Muhammad. So he talks about how, even though that was his blood brother, he really believed that, do you know what, his brother's gone crazy, it's all his fault because he couldn't stick to the rules and adhere to Islam. And in this part of the story as well, in these chapters, although he does talk a lot about some of the beauty of Islam, he talks a lot about the rules, and yeah, he talks a lot about the rules. He's very like technical, you know, we must not eat pork, we must not drink, the white man wants to keep us intoxicated, and this kind of thing. And so at that time, he really didn't understand his brother's situation. And he essentially thought it was like God punishing his brother for doing these things. And he never really understood why his sister Ella wouldn't revert to Islam, wouldn't convert to Islam. He just didn't understand it. And then at the end of this chapter, after 5 years, she embraces Islam. And interestingly enough, in his story, his sister becomes Ella Collins. She becomes a really seminal and profound influence on his life in terms of his religion and his guidance. There's also, police brutality. So when one of their members gets arrested and they march down to the police station, he touches upon that, how the Harlem community had never seen Black men well-dressed, standing up for their rights, and people just started joining them. And if anyone's seen the film, so I also watched the film when I was quite young. I don't know why, actually, it gave me nightmares. I don't know why my parents let me watch it when I was quite young, but I saw the film. And in the film, cinematically, if any of you are into like media and visual media, it's very powerful, because you see the Nation of Islam in their suits, the men, and they're all walking in concert, and then people just join them and join them and join them till they get to the police station, and there's so many of them there. And for me, that part of the book is very, very powerful, because it talks about this power of collective activism. So many people say, oh, protesting, it does nothing, this does nothing. And yet in this part, it really illustrates the power of collective activism in demanding and receiving accountability from the police. Of course, I'm just always interested in equality of the law. When Malcolm is talking to one of his old friends when he comes out of prison, it's his friend that he got arrested with. And interestingly, he's like, you know, we laughed about the fact and how shocked we were when we heard the sentences that were handed down. And we reflected upon the fact that the reason we got such harsh sentences is because we were in the presence of white women. You know, we were with white women when we were committing these crimes, and the law was more annoyed about that, so they received harsher sentences than people who had committed worse crimes. And I think it's interesting because, of course, the law is supposed to be this really just, overriding, equal concept, but obviously it's very, the way it's applied in practice was very racist. And then he touches upon mass incarceration, which actually I don't think is an additional theme. I think I did talk about that a little bit, where he talks about slavery and comparing it to the prison system. And now we are in this age of mass incarceration, where actually in the US and the UK, but in the US more so, there is this boom in people being locked up, and it's mainly people of color, and it's mainly Black people at disproportionate rates to the population size. And then I'm just going to finish here, but just really, really quickly, I couldn't help myself. I know it's a book club and we're supposed to only talk about the book, but in terms of the relevance today, I think that the autobiography of Malcolm X is so relevant to things that we have today. So in some of these pictures, for those of you who aren't aware, the middle ones are the London riots, where people just got really upset about, you know, Mark Duggan being shot by police, so police brutality. There's some from the protests that happened after George Floyd was killed earlier last year. Then there's that headline about, you know, COVID and health inequalities. And there was a brilliant, brilliant Panorama documentary yesterday about people of colour and COVID. If you didn't watch it, you really should. And then also just looking at those who died in police custody. So it's very, very relevant today. And we have to be thinking about that a lot. What has actually changed? Like, you know, what has changed, and has enough changed, and do we need to be doing more? And I think when you continue reading this book, please do think about some of the lessons that the book is teaching us and how we should be more engaged in some of that. So I feel like a starting point is reading Malcolm X's autobiography, and then the next point for all of us is to say, okay, especially those who are Muslim, is there anti-Black racism in our community? Are we seeing unjust treatment of different races, even though we ourselves are minorities, if you are a minority, and what can we do to tackle that? And I think that we need to revive some of that activism of Islam, of that compulsion and obligation almost that we have to challenge injustice when we see it, and not just be passive Muslims. It's not good enough to be passively non-racist. We have to be actively anti-racist and challenge some of these structures and challenge some of these narratives. And I just hope that for those of you who this is your first time reading it, it inspires you to do that. And for those of you who it's your second or third or fourth time reading it, that it re-inspires you to do that. So I'm going to leave it there because I think I've gone over a little bit. So yeah, interestingly enough, so for example, a lot of Black Muslims will tell you that often, even sometimes when you're in the mosque, you get this question where people will say to you, are you Muslim? And you could be in a hijab, you could say Assalamu alaikum, you might have even just finished praying. And you, even as I'm saying it, I'm always laughing because every time it happens, I think, come on, like, you know, you must be joking, you must be pulling my leg. But it comes from this ignorance where people are so used to seeing, when they hear about Islam, they're used to seeing that it's people predominantly of South Asian heritage or people of Arab descent. And so it doesn't even occur to them that you can have Black Muslims. And in this country, Black Muslims do make up a significant percentage of the population. Zara, yeah, exactly what you just mentioned. Or there's an assumption that you must be a revert. So I know that, for example, I've had it before because I didn't always wear hijab. When I started wearing hijab, I remember once being at court and someone at court, when someone said to me, oh, I like your new headscarf or whatever they said. And this guy at court was like, she probably married one of them Muslims, like that. And I was like, well, thanks for speaking for me. But it's just a misconception. And it comes literally from the fact that people are ignorant of the fact that Islam is supposed to be this rainbow colored religion, right? If to be a Hindu or to be a Sikh, you have to be from South Asian heritage. Judaism to an extent is linked to race. Islam has no link to race, like none whatsoever. It never has done. You can be Muslim from any background. But I think, unfortunately, as people, we've done that a disservice, and we often present the face of Islam in a wrong way, so that particularly in this country, it comes across like that. Oh my God, I wish I did, Zainab. So she's asking whether I did work with a guy called Brian Stevenson, who does some incredible work on anti-death penalty things in the US. And yes, Mercy. So Mercy is a book. It's also been made into a film now, and it's absolutely brilliant. So if people haven't read it, that's another one, or even a suggestion for the book club in future. But no, I really admire Brian Stevenson and the work that he does. He does some really brilliant work looking at not just death penalty, but also just Black people in the criminal justice system in the US. And honestly, I found that experience very challenging, working on death penalty cases in the US. And it was probably the most depressing work I've ever done in my life, if I'm going to be honest. But I would go back if I had the opportunity to work with Brian Stevenson, for sure. I think ultimately, for a lot of things I think for a lot of aspects of the criminal justice system, we need to rethink it. So I don't know if I completely agree with abolition, or even, you know, for example, concepts of defunding the police. I think that they are things that potentially sound better on paper, but in terms of practicality, I'm not quite sure how they would work. But I do think we need to rethink all of it, the approach to all of it. And something needs to be done a bit differently. And it shouldn't just be like hardcore law enforcement in that way. That's my humble opinion. So that's a really good question about putting Malcolm X on the school curriculum. When I was training to become a barrister, had this advocacy training with a white QC, and that's QC is Queen's Counsel, someone very, very senior, this older gentleman, and he played videos of great public speakers to show us tips about public speaking, and he showed like Winston Churchill. I can't even remember who he showed. I almost want to say he even showed Enoch Powell, who's this guy that did a speech about rivers of blood that was really anti-immigrant, that basically said, you know, we need to get rid of the immigrants in the UK. And it's known as really racist speech. And someone said to him, oh, you didn't play Malcolm X. And he said Malcolm X was very violent and we don't condone violence. And the thing is, Malcolm X, in his time, people thought, they compared him to Martin Luther King, right? And Martin Luther King was said to be the peaceful Black Christian activist, and he was the aggressive, violent Muslim Black activist. And then over time, after his death, people saw the good he did, and he did change in many ways at the end. But I think that even today, a lot of people think he's too radical. And I think that's why schools would never put him on the curriculum, because they think he's too radical. And yeah, I think he's just too much for them. And I think even now in his death, he's too much for a lot of people. I think there's a lot of Muslims who don't actually necessarily even hold him up to high esteem, and scholars and sheikhs who would say, no, 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 he's too much even now. And it's interesting because I had that conversation with Lena and Maria and Brother Mohammed, who organized this. We had that conversation and we said, even now, he'd probably be too much for a lot of people. But I think it's partly that's the reason. Speak up. I think we all just need to speak up more, and we all need to come together more. So I talked about one of the things in the book that's really powerful is that collective activism. Where is that? We need to come together more and do things like this, talk about literature that we can learn from. When there are issues, bring our collective voices to the table, do something about it, be better allies to different members of our community. I think really when we're learning about this stuff, we need to share the knowledge, but remember the lesson from the book. You might be really enthusiastic to share the knowledge once you finish the book, and people might not be ready to receive it. So you might just have to slow down or feed them in little bites, you know. And I think, though, that's a real big way that we can, I just think we all need to be more vocal, personally. But that's me. I like to talk and I'm all about like activism, but I think we need to be more vocal and we need to come together more to make change. That's one of the also the reasons why I love the book, is because Black women are so often sort of oppressed, overlooked, stereotyped. And in this story, you see this journey Malcolm goes upon, and even the Black women, how they have dignity. And I think the women were empowered to do this partly through those structures that the Nation of Islam imposed. And again, I'm biased, but I'm going to say that Islam more generally imposes. So a lot of the things that the Western world will say makes us more oppressed. Like, I don't know if you all saw, there's this like big case in the papers about a schoolgirl, being a Somali schoolgirl in London, being told her skirt's too long, and it doesn't go with the school uniform. And I'm like, what is going on in this crazy world that you're telling a young girl you need to have a shorter skirt? And so I think a lot of the things that Western society see as oppressing women, actually, when Islam came, and even in this story with the Nation of Islam, and the women were saying that they felt empowered by the fact that they were covering up, by the fact that they're now called sister so-and-so, that they now teach and they have this role in the community. And I think it also goes back to that point that Kautha made about knowledge. She was like, the takeaway is about how knowledge is power. And in the structure of Islam, and in the structure of Nation of Islam, it was so much, even for the women, it was about gain knowledge and teach that knowledge. And I think that's a lot of how the women became empowered. So in the same way the men were coming off the streets, giving up drinking, giving up smoking, and just having this pride in how they dressed, in how they talked, in being educated, the women were doing the same, actually. You know, they were abstaining from sexual relations, they were dressing a certain way, and they felt like they had this elevated status in the community. So I think it's a lot to do with that, to be honest. That's a really, really good question. And yeah, I lived in Houston for half of my work that I did in the US, and I didn't make it to Dallas, but I heard it's wonderful. So for your sisters, I would say in terms of role models, so there are a lot of them out there, but I definitely think Yasmin Mogahed. I'll type it in the chat. I think she's brilliant, and a lot of her writing, and she's very contemporary, and I think young people can relate to her. She's Egyptian American, I believe, and she's got so many brilliant videos on YouTube. And as I said, she's very current. So she's not very much like everything is haram and you must do this, you must do that. She talks about topics that young women are really interested, like love, or you know, how to deal with emotions, how to deal with issues with your parents, how to turn to Almighty Allah when your well-being is low or when you're stressed, and how to have faith in difficult times. And then also this lady, Sheikha Aisha, I hope I'm spelling it right, Aisha Prime. She's an African American sister who, again, she just has a really beautiful manner of speaking. And I think because she also talks about very different topics and talks about a lot of the diversity of Islam and the beauty of Islam, and she comes from more of a revert perspective or convert, whatever you want to call it, she's good. So I would mention those two in the first instance. But definitely, I think there's a lot of good that comes from social media, but I think social media is a really difficult place for young Muslim women and young Muslim girls. A lot of influencers out there, and the influencers themselves are going through their own struggles, and they're sort of taking off their hijab, putting on their hijab, just going through conflicts. And I think it's almost like a shame, and it's sad because our young girls are almost following them on that same battle because they look up to them so much. So I think, inshallah, if you can try and bring your sisters slightly closer to to maybe some people of knowledge as well, not just social media influencers. I'm like, anyone on this call could be a social media influencer. I promise I'm not dissing you. I think they do good work because they increase visibility, and I think our young girls need to see that, but at the same time they just need to balance it. Oh, and Sakina has said Ustada Fatima Megji doing great work with the Mizan Institute. Oh, thank you, Musab. Musab just corrected my spelling, Brother Musab. Aisha Prime, so Iea-Sha. I'm such a fan, and I just butchered her name. Astaghfirullah. But yeah, those are my suggestions. One of the, I was just about to say that, mashallah, Brother Mohammed, you beat me to it. Yeah, I was gonna say, brother, oh my God, my mind's just gone blank. Walid, Dawood Walid. Yeah. He's written some absolutely brilliant stuff. Oh, there you go. It's just been written in the chat. Sheikh Dawood Walid has written some brilliant stuff, and oh, I don't know why my mind is going completely blank. Oh, there's another brother, and he's from the US as well. Why has my mind gone blank? Someone help me. Light-skinned brother, curly hair. Gosh, my mind has gone blank, but yes, Dr. Ware, thank you. Oh, that was going to bother me so much. Dr. Ware, so you've got Dr. Ware there, and I think some people have put some other, yep, and Abdullah Hakim Quick, very, very good. Oh, Kauthar, brilliant. And then someone else mentioned, yeah, so Sheikh Dawood Walid. So those three definitely I'd recommend. And then Sakina, oh, she's always coming with the good knowledge here. Sakina says Ustada Mariam Muaddal. So I don't know Ustada Mariam Muaddal, but I'll definitely look up as well. Oh, brilliant. This chat has turned into like such a helpful resource. So Jazakallah khairan, Ali.